Consul Ho had built an empire on the principle that emotion was a liability, a weakness that got men killed. His face bore the scars of that truth, a jagged line running from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night he learned that mercy was a luxury he could never afford. But as he sat in the dim glow of a hospital room, his perfectly tailored black suit stark against the sterile white walls, his calloused hand wrapped around the frail fingers of Karen Blackman, he realized something that terrified him more than any rival ever could. The woman dying in this bed, the black woman the world dismissed as just his maid, was the only person in 20 years who had ever looked at his scars and seen a man worth saving. Outside, his phone buzzed relentlessly. 12 missed calls from his underboss. A territorial dispute was escalating into a war that could cost him everything he'd built. His lieutenants were waiting for orders. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. But Consul Ho didn't move. Because for the first time in his brutal life, he understood that real power wasn't measured in territory controlled or enemies eliminated. Real power was in the choice he was making right now, to abandon his throne for the dying breaths of the only woman who had ever made him feel human. The heart monitor beeped steadily, each sound marking another second slipping away. And Consul Ho, the man who had spent 2 decades making people disappear, was now begging the universe not to take the one person who made him feel real. Consul Ho's mansion sat on the edge of the city like a fortress, all dark stone and iron gates that screamed one clear message: stay out. Inside, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Men in black suits moved through the hallways with the practiced silence of predators, their eyes always scanning, always calculating. This was a place where weakness got you buried, where hesitation meant death. Everyone who worked here understood the rules. You kept your head down. You did your job. You never, ever looked Consul Ho directly in the face. Everyone except Karen Blackman. She'd been there longer than most of Ho's current crew had been alive. 20 years of polishing mahogany tables, of preparing meals that Ho barely touched, of moving through rooms as if she were part of the architecture itself. The younger members of the organization didn't understand why the boss kept her around. She wasn't young. She wasn't connected. She was just this black woman in her 60s who wore sensible shoes and kept the kitchen spotless. To them, she was invisible. Irrelevant. They had no idea that Karen Blackman was the only reason Consul Ho hadn't completely lost his soul. It started on a Tuesday like most disasters do. Ho had just returned from a meeting that had gone sideways. One of his rivals had disrespected him in front of witnesses, and in his world, disrespect was a debt that had to be paid in blood. He'd walked into the mansion with murder in his eyes, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. His men scattered like roaches when lights flip on. They knew what was coming. Someone was going to die tonight, and nobody wanted to be in the blast radius when Ho decided who. He found Karen in the kitchen, elbow deep in soapy water, scrubbing a pot that was already clean. She didn't turn around when he entered. Didn't flinch when he slammed his fist on the marble counter hard enough to crack it. Do you know what he called me? Ho's voice was low, dangerous. In Korean, then switching to English because Karen had made him promise years ago to practice. Do you know what that piece of garbage said to my face? Karen set down the pot, dried her hands on her apron, and finally turned to look at him. Her eyes went straight to his face, to that scar that split his features like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. Most people looked away. His own men couldn't hold his gaze for more than a few seconds before their eyes dropped to the floor. Karen just looked at him. Really looked at him. I know what he said, she replied, her voice calm as Sunday morning. And I know what you're planning to do about it. But before you go out there and prove him right about what kind of man you are, why don't you sit down and eat something? When was the last time you had a real meal? Ho stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Here he was, one of the most feared men in the city, veins full of rage and adrenaline, and this woman was worried about whether he'd eaten lunch. It should have made him angrier. It should have reminded him that caring about anything was a weakness his enemies would exploit. Instead, he sat down. That was the thing about Karen that nobody else understood. She had this way of cutting through all the violence and posturing and seeing straight to the truth underneath. While everyone else saw Consul Ho, the scarred monster, the ruthless businessman, the man who'd clawed his way up from nothing by being harder and colder than everyone around him, Karen just saw Ho. A man who'd survived things that should have killed him. A man who carried so much pain he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She slid a plate in front of him. Rice perfectly steamed. Kimchi she'd made herself. Bulgogi that smelled like his mother's kitchen before everything went wrong. He picked up the chopsticks with hands that had broken bones and ended lives, and for just a moment, those hands trembled. "You think feeding me is going to change anything?" he asked, but there was no bite in it. "No," Karen said simply, sitting down across from him like they were equals, like she wasn't an employee in a crime lord's house. "But maybe it'll remind you that revenge tastes like nothing. It fills you up for about 5 minutes and then you're empty again looking for the next thing to be angry about. That's no way to live, baby. That's just a slow way to die." She called him baby. This woman who had every reason to be terrified of him called him baby like he was her son, like he mattered beyond what he could do or who he could hurt. And the craziest part? He let her. Here's what most people don't understand about power. Real strength isn't about who's afraid of you. Any fool with a gun can make people scared. True power is about who trusts you enough to tell you the truth when the truth might get them killed. Karen had that power over Ho in ways his entire organization didn't. That night, Ho didn't go after his rival. He stayed in the kitchen until the rice got cold, listening to Karen talk about her daughter's upcoming graduation, about the neighbor's cat that kept getting into her garden, about normal things that existed in a world so far removed from his that they might as well have been on different planets. And somewhere in that conversation, the rage that had been burning in his chest since the meeting just went out. His men never understood why their boss spared that rival. They saw it as weakness, as Ho losing his edge. But Ho knew the truth. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is choose not to become the monster everyone expects him to be. Karen had taught him that, one meal at a time, one honest conversation at a time. She was the only person in his entire brutal world who looked at his scars and didn't see a weapon. She saw a survivor. And that made all the difference. It happened on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after that conversation in the kitchen. Ho was in his office reviewing shipping manifests that weren't really about shipping when he heard something that made his blood freeze. A sound he'd never heard in 20 years. Karen crying out in pain. He was down the hallway before his mind caught up with his legs. Found her collapsed against the wall near the laundry room, one hand pressed to her chest, her face twisted in agony. The basket of clean sheets she'd been carrying was scattered across the floor like snow. For a man who'd seen every kind of violence the world had to offer, the sight of Karen Blackman crumpled on the ground hit him harder than any bullet ever had. "Don't you dare," he said, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering over her body like he was afraid touching her might break her further. "Don't you dare do this. Not you." Karen tried to smile even through the pain. Even now, she was trying to comfort him. "I'm all right, baby. Just got a little dizzy is all. Help me up an aisle?" "You're not getting up." Ho pulled out his phone, barked orders in Korean so fast the words blurred together. Then he scooped Karen into his arms like she weighed nothing, and if anyone had told him a year ago that he'd be carrying his housekeeper through his mansion while his hardened criminals rushed to open doors, he would have laughed in their face. But here he was, and the only thing that mattered was the woman struggling to breathe in his arms. The hospital was 15 minutes away. Ho made it in 7. His driver ran 4 red lights and nearly killed a pedestrian, but Ho didn't care. Let the cops come. Let the whole city watch. Karen's breathing was getting shallower with each passing second, and that sound was worse than any torture he'd ever witnessed. By the time they arrived, Ho had already made 6 more calls. Money talks, and when you have enough of it, money screams. Within 20 minutes of Karen being rushed into emergency care, Ho had bought out an entire private wing on the 4th floor. Not rented. Bought. He didn't care what it cost. His accountant would have a heart attack when he saw the numbers, but Ho had learned something that most people spend their whole lives missing. You can't take your money with you when you die, but you sure as hell can use it to keep the people you love alive a little longer. The doctors ran their tests. Ran them again. Then came back with faces that Ho recognized immediately because he'd seen that expression before, usually right before someone begged for their life. Stage 4. Aggressive. Inoperable. The words hit like body blows, each one heavier than the last. They gave her months, maybe weeks. Told Ho he should prepare himself, should make arrangements, should accept the inevitable. Ho looked at the lead doctor, a nervous man named Dr. Kwan who kept adjusting his glasses like they might protect him from what was coming. "You're going to fix this," Ho said quietly. "Mr. Ho, I understand this is difficult, but the cancer has metastasized too. I don't care if it's metastasized to Mars. You're going to fix this." Dr. Kwan swallowed hard. "Sir, some things even money can't." The look Ho gave him could have stripped paint off walls. "Then find me someone who can. I want specialists flown in from every corner of this planet. I want experimental treatments. I want options that don't exist yet. You have 48 hours to give me a plan that doesn't involve me planning a funeral. Are we clear? They were clear. Within 2 days, Karen's room looked like a war room staffed by the best medical minds money could acquire. Oncologists from Seoul, immunotherapy researchers from Germany, a specialist in palliative care from Toronto who charged more per hour than most people made in a month. Ho sat through every consultation, understood maybe half of what they said, and rejected every timeline that didn't end with Karen walking out of that hospital on her own 2 feet. But here's what Ho was learning the hard way, what every person eventually learns when they come face to face with mortality: there are some battles you can't win with money or muscle or connections. Death doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't negotiate. And watching Karen slip away a little more each day was teaching Ho a lesson he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. Control is an illusion. We pretend we're in charge of our lives, that if we're just smart enough or strong enough or ruthless enough, we can bend the universe to our will. Then something like cancer comes along and reminds you that you're not the director of this movie. You're just another actor reading lines written by someone else. His men didn't know what to make of the situation. Here was their boss, the man who'd once burned down a rival's restaurant with everyone still inside because someone had insulted his mother's memory, and now he was camping out in a hospital room, sleeping in a chair that cost less than his shoes. The organization was falling apart without his attention. Territories were being challenged. Money was going missing. His underboss, a scarred bulldog of a man named Kong, kept calling with increasingly desperate updates. "We need you here," Kong said during one particularly tense phone call. "The Tanaka crew is moving in on our waterfront operations. They're saying you've gone soft, that you're distracted. If we don't respond now, we'll lose everything you built." Ho looked at Karen sleeping in the hospital bed, tubes running from her arms, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed more fragile each day. "Let them have it," he said. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Boss, did you just? You heard me. Give them the waterfront. Give them whatever they want. But that's millions in revenue. Years of, I don't care." Ho's voice was flat, final. "Handle it however you need to. I'm not leaving." He hung up before Kong could respond. And in that moment, Ho understood something that would have seemed impossible to him just months ago. He'd spent 20 years building an empire, convincing himself that power and territory and respect were the things that mattered. But sitting in that hospital room, watching the only person who'd ever truly seen him fight a battle she couldn't win, he realized that he'd had it backwards the whole time. The empire was just stuff. Territory was just dirt. Respect from men who'd sell you out the second you showed weakness was worthless. But this woman, this black woman who the world had dismissed as help, who'd never asked him for anything except to be a better man than his scars demanded, she was the only real thing in his entire life. The other patients and their families started complaining about Ho's security detail. Couldn't really blame them. Having a dozen men in black suits posted throughout a hospital wing, all wearing visible weapons and communicating through earpieces, wasn't exactly comforting to people bringing their kids in for tonsillectomies. The hospital administrator, a stern woman named Mrs. Vega, approached Ho about it. "Mr. Ho, I understand you're going through a difficult time, but the other patients are frightened. Surely we can find a less intimidating arrangement." Ho didn't even look up from where he was reading to Karen from a book she'd mentioned loving as a girl. Something about a young woman finding herself in Paris. "My men stay. If the other patients have a problem with that, buy out their wings too. Send me the bill." Mrs. Vega opened her mouth, closed it, then wisely chose to walk away. You learn quickly in life that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially against a man who's already losing the only war that matters to him. 3 days into Karen's stay, she woke up lucid for the first time since the collapse. Her eyes found Ho immediately, sitting in that same chair he'd barely left, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. Ho actually laughed. Leave it to Karen to be dying and still worried about how he looked. "Yeah, well, you're not exactly at your best either. Always knew you were a charmer." She reached out a trembling hand, and he took it in both of his, careful not to disturb the four. "You need to go home. Get some sleep. Take care of your business. The world doesn't stop just because I'm." "Don't?" His grip tightened slightly. "Don't finish that sentence. Baby, we both know. I said don't." His voice cracked on the last word, and that's when Karen saw it. This man who'd built himself into something harder than steel was breaking apart right in front of her. You don't get to tell me what matters right now. You don't get to act like you're just some employee I can replace. You're the only good thing in my entire miserable life, Karen. The only person who ever looked at me and saw something worth saving. So no, I'm not going home. I'm not taking care of business. I'm staying right here until you get better. The heart monitor beeped steadily between them, measuring out the seconds neither of them could get back. And if I don't get better? Karen asked quietly. Ho had no answer for that. Because for the first time in his brutal, violent life, he was facing an enemy he couldn't intimidate, couldn't outthink, couldn't defeat. And it was teaching him the hardest lesson there is. Sometimes love means sitting in the pain with someone, knowing you can't fix it, knowing that all your power and money and connections can't change what's coming. Sometimes all you can do is hold their hand and refuse to let the darkness take them alone. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 9 days after Karen had been admitted. Ho was half asleep in that uncomfortable chair when his phone lit up with Kang's number for the third time that hour. He'd been ignoring it. But Kang was persistent, and persistence usually meant problems that wouldn't solve themselves. This better be life or death, Ho answered, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't wake Karen. It is. Kang's voice was tight. The Singapore deal. They're pulling out unless you show up personally to close it. They land in 6 hours. If you're not at that meeting, we lose everything. Ho rubbed his eyes with his free hand. The Singapore deal. 3 months of negotiations. A partnership that would legitimize half his operations and open up shipping routes that could triple his revenue. $15 million on the table, maybe more if he played it right. The kind of deal that came around once in a lifetime. Tell them I can't make it. The silence on the other end lasted so long Ho thought the call had dropped. Boss, did you hear what I just said? 15 million. That's not including the long-term percentages. This could set us up for the next decade. I heard you. And I said no. They specifically said you. Not me, not anyone else. They want to meet the man in charge. It's about respect, about Kong. Ho's voice went cold in that way that usually made grown men reconsider their life choices. How long have you worked for me? 12 years. And in those 12 years, have I ever explained myself to you? Another pause. No, boss. So why are you still talking? The line went dead. Ho set the phone face down on the small table next to Karen's bed and tried to close his eyes again. But sleep wouldn't come. Because as much as he wanted to pretend that conversation hadn't happened, his mind kept doing the math. 15 million. Territory expansion. Security for his crew and their families. The respect of the other organizations. Everything he'd worked for since he was 16 years old and decided that poverty and powerlessness would never touch him again. All of it on one side of the scale. And on the other side, a dying woman who technically didn't even work for him anymore, who couldn't give him anything except her presence, who represented everything his world said he should have outgrown by now. The scale shouldn't have even been close. Any rational person would take the meeting. Would explain to Karen that this was important, that he'd be back in a few hours, that she'd understand because she always understood. She might even insist he go. That's the kind of person she was. But Ho had spent his whole life being rational, being smart, making the hard choices that kept him alive and on top. And where had it gotten him? Sitting alone in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, terrified that the steady beeping of that heart monitor might stop while he was out chasing money he didn't even need. His phone buzzed again. Not Kong this time. A text from his accountant, a nervous man named Vincent who usually knew better than to bother Ho directly. The message was simple. The Singapore deal funds our operations for Q2. Without it, we'll need to make cuts. Possibly significant ones. Ho stared at that message for a long time. Cuts meant people losing jobs. Families losing income. The same families who'd been loyal to him for years, who'd taken bullets and prison sentences because they believed in what he'd built. He had responsibilities to them. Obligations. But he also had an obligation to the woman in that bed. And maybe that's what nobody else understood. Maybe loyalty isn't about doing what makes financial sense. Maybe it's about showing up for the people who showed up for you when they had every reason to walk away. Karen stirred, her eyes opening slowly. Even in the dim light from the hallway, Ho could see how much weight she'd lost. How the illness was hollowing her out from the inside. Can't sleep? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Just thinking. About the Singapore thing? Ho's head snapped up. How do you know about that? Baby, I've been cleaning your office for 20 years. You think I don't know when something big is happening? She tried to smile but it came out weak. You should go. That kind of money could. Stop. I'm serious. I'll be fine. The nurses here are wonderful and it's just a few hours. You could make it there and back before. I said stop. Ho leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You want to know what I've learned sitting in this room for the past 9 days? I've learned that I've spent my entire adult life chasing the wrong things. Building the wrong empire. Trying to fill a hole inside me with money and power and respect from people who'd forget my name 5 minutes after I'm dead. That's not true. You've built something. I've built nothing. The words came out harder than he meant them to. Nothing that matters. Nothing that makes me feel the way I feel when you tell me I did something right. Nothing that's worth a damn if you're not there to see it. Karen's eyes filled with tears and Ho realized his were doing the same. When was the last time he'd cried? He couldn't even remember. Crying was weakness. Crying got you killed. Except right now he didn't care about any of that. The Singapore deal is $15 million, he continued. Do you know how much I'd pay for 1 more year with you? 1 more month? Hell, 1 more conversation in your kitchen where you tell me I'm being an idiot and I actually listen. Money can't buy that, baby. I know. That's exactly my point. He took her hand, the one without the 4, and held it like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. I've spent 20 years learning how to take things from people. How to leverage and negotiate and always come out on top. But you taught me something nobody else could. You taught me that the things worth having can't be taken. They can only be given. And you gave me something I didn't even know I needed. You gave me proof that I'm more than what I do. That underneath all the scars and violence, there's still something human left. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm, counting down seconds that felt more precious than any amount of money. So no, Ho said firmly. I'm not going to Singapore. I'm not taking the meeting. Let the deal fall through. Let the whole empire collapse if that's what it takes. Because here's what I finally understand. You can rebuild an empire. You can make new deals and find new partnerships and stack money until you're drowning in it. But you can't rebuild this. You can't negotiate for more time with the people who actually matter. And when you're gone, when this room is empty and I'm standing at your funeral pretending I'm fine, that Singapore money won't mean a damn thing. Karen was crying openly now, tears running down her cheeks. You're going to regret this. When things get tight, when you have to make those cuts. Then I'll make them. I'll figure it out. I always do. He squeezed her hand gently. But I won't regret being here. I won't regret choosing you over a conference room full of suits who don't give a damn about me beyond what I can do for them. I've made a lot of choices I regret, Karen. Staying with you isn't going to be one of them. His phone buzzed again. More messages from Kong, from Vincent, from associates who'd heard about the Singapore situation and were weighing in with their opinions. Ho picked up the phone, turned it completely off and dropped it in the small trash can next to the bed. Karen actually laughed at that, a weak sound but genuine. That was dramatic. I'm a dramatic guy. That phone cost more than my car. I'll buy another one. He settled back in his chair, still holding her hand. After you get better, you can take me shopping for it. Make sure I don't waste my money on something ridiculous. They both knew she wasn't getting better. The doctors had been clear about that. But sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone hope, even when hope is a lie you're both agreeing to believe. Outside, the sun was starting to rise over the city. Ho could see it through the window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that he'd never bothered to notice before. Somewhere out there, the Singapore delegation was landing. Somewhere, Kong was probably having a panic attack. Somewhere, his empire was cracking at the foundation because its builder had walked away. And Ho didn't care. Not even a little bit. Because he'd finally figured out what actually matters in this life. It's not about how much you accumulate or how many people fear your name. It's about who you're willing to lose everything for. It's about choosing love over logic, presence over profit, and sitting in an uncomfortable chair in a sterile hospital room because the person in that bed is worth more than everything you've ever owned combined. That's the price of real loyalty. And for the first time in his brutal, calculating life, Consul Ho was willing to pay it. The memory hit Ho without warning as he watched Karen sleep that afternoon. One moment he was counting her breaths, and the next he was back in his study 7 years ago, standing over a man tied to a chair with blood running down his face. The man's name was Dmitri, a Russian middleman who'd been skimming money from their joint operations. Not much. Maybe 50,000 over 6 months. But in Ho's world, theft wasn't about the amount. It was about the principle. You let one man steal and walk away, everyone thinks you're weak. Everyone starts taking pieces until there's nothing left. Dmitri was begging in broken English, promising to pay it back, swearing on his mother's grave that it would never happen again. Ho had heard it all before. The pleading always sounded the same, regardless of language. And it never changed what came next. He'd pulled his gun, checked the chamber out of habit. His men were positioned around the room, ready to clean up afterward. This was business. Necessary. The kind of thing he'd done dozens of times without losing a minute of sleep. Then Karen walked in. She wasn't supposed to be there. It was past midnight and she usually went home by 9. But she'd left her reading glasses in the kitchen and came back for them, and somehow ended up in the hallway outside his study right as Ho pressed the gun against Dimitri's temple. "Don't," she said from the doorway. Ho's men reached for their weapons, but he held up a hand to stop them. He didn't lower the gun though. Didn't step back. "You need to leave, Karen. Right now. Not until you put that down. This doesn't concern you." The hell it doesn't. She walked into the room like she was entering her own kitchen, like there wasn't a man bleeding in a chair and 4 armed criminals staring at her. "You really going to kill this man? Right here in your own house? He stole from me. And killing him brings the money back?" Karen looked at Dmitri, then back at Ho. "Baby, I know what you do. I'm not stupid. I've been cleaning blood out of your carpets for 6 years. But this is different." "How is it different?" "Because you're angry, not thinking. Because this man has a family. Because once you pull that trigger you can't take it back, and I've seen what that does to you afterward." She stepped closer, close enough that Ho could have touched her. "I've seen you sitting alone at 3 in the morning drinking yourself numb. I've heard you having nightmares about all the things you can't undo. And I'm not going to stand by and watch you add another ghost to that collection." Ho's hand was shaking. The gun felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "If I let him go, I look weak. My own men will question me. Then let them question you. Being strong doesn't mean doing the cruelest thing you can think of. It means having the guts to choose mercy when everyone expects violence." Karen's voice softened. "I know the world you live in. I know the rules. But you're not just the rules, Ho. You're more than what this life demands. And if you pull that trigger right now, you're not proving you're strong. You're proving you're scared of what happens if people see you being human." The room was dead silent. Ho could feel his men watching, judging, calculating what this meant for the organization. By every rule he'd ever learned, he should shoot Dmitri and then deal with Karen's insubordination. That's what his father would have done. What every boss before him would have done. Instead he lowered the gun. "Get him out of here," Ho said to his men. "Put him on a plane back to Moscow. Tell everyone he paid his debt and we're square." His second-in-command at the time, a vicious enforcer named Taeyong, looked at him like he'd grown horns. "Boss, if we just let him walk." Did I stutter? They cut Dmitri loose and dragged him out, the Russian still crying and thanking God in a language nobody understood. When the room cleared, it was just Ho and Karen standing in a space that still smelled like fear and copper. "You just cost me respect," Ho said quietly. "My own crew is going to think I've gone soft. Maybe. Or maybe they'll think you're smart enough to know that not every problem needs a bullet." Karen walked over to the chair Dmitri had been tied to and started wiping the blood off with a handkerchief from her purse. "Your father ran his empire on fear. And where did that get him? Dead at 43 with nobody at his funeral except the people who had to be there. You want that same ending? My father was weak. He trusted the wrong people. Your father was lonely." Karen looked up at him with those eyes that always seemed to see right through his armor. "He built walls so high nobody could get in, and then he died alone behind them. You're doing the same thing, baby. Every time you choose violence over mercy, every time you prove how hard you are, you're adding another brick to your own prison." Ho wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that she didn't understand his world, that softness got you killed, that his father's mistake wasn't being lonely but being careless. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep down he knew she was right. "I can't be weak," he finally said. "Not in this life. I'm not asking you to be weak. I'm asking you to be wise." Karen finished cleaning the chair and stood up, her knees cracking in that way that reminded Ho she was getting older. Strength is easy. Any fool with a gun is strong. But wisdom? Knowing when to fight and when to show mercy? That's what separates the bosses who build something lasting from the ones who end up in early graves. She left him standing there in that study, surrounded by the weapons and money and power that were supposed to make him feel secure. And for the first time in years, Ho felt completely exposed. Because Karen had seen something in him that he'd been trying to kill since he was a teenager. She'd seen the part of him that still believed people could be better than their worst moments. The part that wanted to build something beyond fear. That night changed everything between them. It wasn't romantic, wasn't sexual. It was deeper than that. Karen became the voice in his head that asked whether what he was about to do was necessary or just habit. The person who reminded him that he could choose differently. And slowly, over years, Ho's empire started to look different. Still ruthless when it needed to be, but strategic. Measured. Less about proving something and more about actually building something worth having. Sitting in that hospital room now, watching Karen struggle for each breath, Ho understood what she'd really given him that night. She'd given him permission to be human. In a world that demanded he be a monster, she'd looked at him and said, "You're allowed to be more than this." And he'd spent 7 years trying to live up to that faith. Now she was leaving. And the thought of facing this brutal world without her voice in his head, without her gentle corrections and hard truths, was more terrifying than any enemy he'd ever faced. Because Karen Blackman hadn't just protected his humanity that night. She'd protected it every single day since. And Ho had no idea how to be the man she believed he could be without her there to remind him. The doctors told Ho on a Wednesday morning that it was time. They used softer words than that, talked about Karen's organs shutting down and her pain levels becoming unmanageable, but what they meant was simple. She had hours left, maybe a day if they were lucky. They asked if he wanted to call anyone. Family members who should say goodbye. Ho told them Karen's daughter was studying abroad in France, already informed, already grieving from a distance because she couldn't get a flight back in time. Told them there was no one else. Just him. And that was enough because it had to be. He sent his men away that afternoon. All of them. Even the 2 guards he'd kept posted outside Karen's door for the past 2 weeks. They protested, said it wasn't safe, that he needed protection. But Ho just looked at them with eyes so tired they could barely focus and said, "Who's going to hurt me in a hospital room? Go home. Be with your families. That's an order." When they were gone, he locked the door behind them and turned back to Karen's bed. She was awake but barely, her eyes half open and cloudy with morphine. The machines around her had multiplied over the past few days, each one monitoring some system that was failing, each beep and hiss a reminder that her body was giving up. "Hey," he said softly, pulling his chair close to her bedside. "It's just us now." Karen's lips moved but no sound came out at first. Ho leaned in closer, his ear near her mouth. "What is it?" "I sent them away," she managed each word in effort. "Stubborn, a man. Takes one to know one." He tried to smile but his face wouldn't cooperate. "I need to do something, Karen. And I need to do it alone. No witnesses. Just you and me." He stood up and walked to the small closet where they'd stored Karen's personal belongings. Reached into the inside pocket of his jacket hanging there and pulled out a small wooden box he'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. Except there was no right moment for this. There was just now and the rapidly shrinking amount of time they had left. Inside the box was a ring. Not just any ring. His mother's jade ring, the only thing he had left from her before she died when he was 12. Green jade set in worn gold, simple but beautiful. His mother had told him once that jade was protection, that it absorbed the negative energy around you and kept your spirit clean. She'd made him promise to give it to someone worthy when the time came. He'd carried that ring for 30 years waiting, had never found anyone who felt right. Until now. Ho knelt beside Karen's bed. Not in the chair. On the floor, his knees against the cold hospital tile. In Korean culture there are different kinds of bows. The casual nod you give strangers. The respectful bow for elders. And then there's the full bow, the kind where you kneel and touch your forehead to the ground. That bow is reserved for the most sacred things. Parents. Ancestors. The people who gave you life and meaning. In my culture, Ho said, his voice breaking, we have a saying. The people who raise you aren't always the people who give birth to you. Sometimes they're the people who see you at your worst and choose to stay anyway. Who teach you how to be human when the whole world is trying to make you a monster. Karen's eyes focused on him, clarity breaking through the morphine fog. Baby, what are you? Let me finish. Please. He took her left hand, the one without all the tubes, and held it between both of his. You saved my life 20 years ago when you walked into my house and decided I was worth the effort. Every meal you cooked, every time you told me I was wrong, every moment you looked at these scars and didn't flinch, you were saving me over and over again. And I never thanked you properly. Never told you what you meant. He brought her hand to his forehead, a gesture of deep respect his mother had taught him. In the old traditions, a son honors his mother this way. But you've been more than that to me. You've been my teacher, my conscience, the only person in this entire world who made me want to be better than what I was. Tears were streaming down Karen's face now, and Ho's too. He opened the wooden box and took out the jade ring. This was my mother's. The only thing I have left of her. And she told me to give it to someone worthy. Someone who deserved to carry her memory forward. He slipped the ring gently onto Karen's finger, adjusting it so it wouldn't fall off her thin hand. I can't think of anyone more worthy than you. Then Consul Ho, the man who'd built an empire on never bowing to anyone, pressed his forehead to the floor in a full traditional bow. The kind of bow that says you are above me. You are worthy of my ultimate respect. Everything I am exists because you made it possible. He stayed there for a long moment, his forehead against the cold tile, his hands flat on the ground. And in that position, all the walls he'd built over decades came crashing down. He sobbed. Actually sobbed like a child, his whole body shaking with grief he'd been holding back for 2 weeks. You don't bow to me, Karen whispered, trying to reach for him. You're not just anything. Ho lifted his head but stayed on his knees. You're the queen of my heart. The only royalty I've ever recognized. And when you go, you're taking the best parts of me with you. So please let me do this. Let me honor you the way you deserve to be honored all along. Karen's breathing was getting shallower. The monitors were changing their rhythm, alarms starting to beep softly. But she smiled through her tears and touched the jade ring on her finger. Your mama, she would have liked me? She would have loved you. Just like I do. The words came out before Ho could stop them. Words he'd never said to anyone. Words that felt like ripping his chest open and showing her everything inside. I love you, Karen. Not like a boss loves an employee. Not even like a son loves a mother. I love you like you're the only thing in this universe that ever made sense to me. I love you too, baby. Karen's voice was fading, getting quieter with each word. You're going to be okay. You're going to keep being the man I know you are. I don't know how to do that without you. Yes, you do. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. You just remember. Every choice, ask yourself, would this make Karen proud? And you'll know what to do. The monitors were screaming now, but Ho ignored them. Stayed on his knees holding her hand, the jade ring catching the light from the window. Karen's eyes started to close, her breathing becoming irregular. And Ho, the man who'd faced death 100 times without flinching, felt true terror for the first time in his life. Don't go, he whispered. Please. I'm not ready. But death doesn't care if you're ready. It comes when it comes, and all you can do is hold on to the people you love until the very last second. Karen Blackman took her final breath at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, with a jade ring on her finger and the most dangerous man in the city kneeling at her bedside like a servant before a queen. Her last words were barely audible, but Ho heard them. Thank you, for letting me love you. Then she was gone. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing Ho had ever heard. Ho stayed in that room for 3 hours after Karen's heart stopped. Just sat there holding her hand, feeling the warmth slowly leave her body while the machines finally went quiet. The nurses tried to come in twice, but he'd locked the door and wouldn't answer their knocking. They eventually gave up, left him alone with his grief. When he finally stood up, his legs barely worked. He'd been on his knees so long the circulation had cut off. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness that had opened up inside his chest. It felt like someone had reached in and ripped out everything that mattered, leaving just a hollow space where his heart used to be. He called Kong from the hallway, his voice flat and emotionless. Arrange the funeral. I want it done right. No expense spared. And Kong? If anyone shows up trying to use this as an opportunity to move on our territory, I want their name. We'll deal with them after. Understood, boss. Are you okay? Ho almost laughed at that question. Okay. What a useless word. Just handle it. The funeral was 4 days later, on a Saturday morning that had no right being so beautiful. Sunny skies and birds singing like the world hadn't just lost the best person in it. Ho had arranged everything exactly how Karen would have wanted. A small church in the neighborhood where she'd grown up. Gospel music. Flowers everywhere, the kind she used to grow in the little garden behind his mansion. Her daughter flew in from France, a young woman named Trinity who had her mother's eyes and her mother's strength. She hugged Ho at the service, whispered, "Thank you for taking care of her," and he nearly broke right there in front of everyone. Nearly fell apart completely. But he held it together because that's what Karen would have expected. The church was packed. That surprised him. Karen had always seemed so quiet, so private. But apparently she'd touched more lives than he'd realized. Former neighbors, people from her church, women she'd met at the grocery store who remembered her kindness. They all came to say goodbye to a woman the world had overlooked but who had somehow made everyone she met feel seen. Ho sat in the front row in a black suit that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by his men who stood out like wolves at a sheep convention. And he listened to person after person get up and talk about what Karen had meant to them. How she'd helped someone's kid with homework. How she brought food to a family going through hard times. How she'd always had a kind word even when life was beating her down. Nobody mentioned that she'd worked for a crime boss. Nobody talked about the dangerous world she'd existed in for 20 years. They just talked about Karen. Just her. And Ho realized that while he'd thought he was the only one who knew her, the truth was different. Lots of people had known her. He'd just been the lucky one who got to keep her close. After the service, after they'd put her in the ground with his mother's jade ring still on her finger, Ho went back to his office for the first time in 3 weeks. The place felt different. Smaller somehow. Like returning to a house you'd lived in as a kid and realizing it was never as big as you remembered. Kong was waiting with updates. The Singapore deal had fallen through just like Ho knew it would. They'd lost contracts, lost territory, lost respect in the eyes of the other organizations. On paper, the past 3 weeks had been a disaster for his empire. How bad is it? Ho asked, pouring himself a drink he didn't really want. Bad, Kong admitted. The Tanaka crew took our waterfront operations. The Russians are sniffing around our import routes. And our own people are getting nervous. They're wondering if you're still capable of running things. Ho downed the whiskey, felt it burn going down. Set up a meeting with all the crew chiefs. Tomorrow. I need to address this head on. The meeting happened in the back room of a restaurant Ho owned, 20 men who'd built their lives on his leadership all sitting around a table wondering if he'd lost his edge. He could see it in their eyes. The doubt. The calculation. The quiet assessment of whether it was time to start looking for other opportunities. Ho stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn. I know what you're thinking. That I went soft. That I chose a dying woman over the business. That I've lost what made me dangerous. He paused, let that sink in. And you're right. I did choose her. I chose her over money, over territory, over everything we'd built. And I'd do it again without hesitation. The room was dead silent. Nobody knew where this was going. But here's what you need to understand, Ho continued. Karen Blackman taught me something in 20 years that none of you have figured out yet. Power isn't about how much you can take. It's about what you're willing to protect. And an empire built only on fear and greed is an empire that dies the second you do. He pulled out a folder, dropped it on the table. Inside were plans he'd been working on in the hospital during Karen's lucid moments. We're changing how we operate. We're going legit where we can. We're cutting the operations that hurt regular people. And we're starting a foundation in Karen's name that's going to help families in the neighborhoods where we do business. Education. Job training. Real opportunities. One of the older crew chiefs, a man named Byung, laughed incredulously. You want to run a charity? Boss, with all respect, we're criminals. That's not how this works. Then we change how it works. Ho's voice went cold. I've spent 20 years taking from this city. Karen spent 20 years giving to it. Her way was better. Smarter. More sustainable. And if you can't see that, there's the door. Nobody moved. Because even questioning his purpose, they all recognized something in Ho's eyes that hadn't been there before. Not weakness. Something harder. Something more dangerous than simple cruelty. Purpose. The foundation launched 3 months later. The Karen Blackman Community Center opened in her old neighborhood, offering after-school programs and job counseling and meals for families struggling to make it. Ho funded it completely, funneled money from his operations into something that actually helped people instead of hurting them. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. His rivals thought it was a cover for something else. But Ho didn't care what anyone thought. Every kid who got tutoring, every family who got help, that was Karen's legacy continuing. That was proof that her life had meant something beyond just the people who'd known her personally. And slowly, something strange started happening. The community that had always feared Ho's organization started working with it. Tips came in about rival operations. Protection became real instead of just extortion. The empire didn't shrink. It changed. became something different. Something that Karen might have actually been proud of. Ho still did what needed to be done when people crossed lines. He wasn't a saint. But now every decision ran through a filter that sounded like Karen's voice in his head. Would this make me proud? And if the answer was no, he found a different way. Late at night, when the work was done and the city was quiet, Ho would sit in his study and look at the photo he'd put on his desk. Karen in his kitchen, smiling at the camera like she just told a joke. In the photo, you could see part of his hand reaching for a plate she'd prepared. A moment of normalcy in a life that had been anything but normal. People who knew what he'd given up for her thought he was crazy. $15 million. Territory. Power. All of it sacrificed for a woman who'd been dead before any of it could matter to her. But Ho understood something they didn't. Karen had given him 20 years of seeing him as more than a monster. And in her final hours, he'd finally become the man she'd always believed he could be. That wasn't a sacrifice. That was the best trade he'd ever made. Because true power isn't measured in what you take from the world. It's measured in what you leave behind. And Karen Blackman had left behind a brutal man transformed into someone who actually gave a damn. That legacy was worth more than any empire. In the end, Karen Blackman taught a powerful man what no empire ever could: how to be human. If this story moved you even a little, don't just scroll past it. Someone loved quietly. Someone mattered deeply. Someone was seen too late. Honor Karen Blackman by doing the simplest thing, like, comment, subscribe or share so this story reaches someone who still has time to show up for the people they love. Because ignoring this is how people like her get forgotten.